Hi, everybody. This is Brooke Warner, and Linda Joy is here with me. Hi, Linda Joy.
Hi, Brooke, and hi, everybody. Welcome.
Welcome to this exciting installment of our best-selling series, and this one is Brain on Fire. And we would like to also just give a quick shout-out and hello. We love to see all the names and people we know and people we don't know, and welcome you saying hi in the questions tab and letting us know where you're calling in from, because it's fun for us to see that people are calling in from all over the world, including Linda Joy tonight, who's calling in from London. So that's
Yes.
unusual.
Yeah.
All
Welcome.
right.
We're so glad to have you all here.
Yes, welcome. Welcome, everyone. All right, so we're going to be talking tonight about how to write a memoir that changes lives. And we do these freebies all the time to give you a little bit of a sense of our teaching, and then we offer longer courses that we're going to spend just a couple minutes talking about at the end. But this is chock full of information for you guys about this book, and we are always specifically looking to teach you in these 4-week classes how these bestsellers can inform your writing. And before we do that, we're going to introduce ourselves for those of you who don't know us. So go ahead. Bye.
Okay. I'm Linda Joy Myers, and I'm the president of the National Association of Memoir Writers. And I'm the author of a new memoir coming out this spring called Song of the Plains. And I have Don't Call Me Mother, The Power of Memoir, and Journey of Memoir.
And I'm Brooke, and I'm the publisher of She Writes Press, and I also have a coaching practice, Warner Coaching, and my 2 books on writing and publishing are Greenlight Your Book and What's Your Book, and then I've written How to Sell Your Memoir. And then Linda Joy and I are very excited to announce that we have our new anthology, The Magic of Memoir, coming out this November, so very soon. And then we're also the co-authors of Breaking Ground on Your Memoir. So we have lots of memoir stuff going on.
See how passionate we are. Yes.
Yes, we devour this stuff and love it. So I'm going to kick off here with a look at the mission-driven sensibility in Brain on Fire. I talked in this slide about how to have a mission as opposed to an agenda for your memoir. Again, before I get too far into this, I want to say I welcome your questions along the way, or put it in the, we want to have a Q&A section at the end. So the mission-driven memoir is one people are driven to write memoir in the first place because they have a mission. There's something that has happened to them, an experience that they've gone through, some deep calling to write your memoir. And I'm sure that many of you are in that position. Now, an agenda obviously is a little bit of a different kind of book and almost has a negative connotation in this sense, because an agenda means that you really have something that you want to get out into the world, but it doesn't necessarily have a mission behind it, which is a little bit of a more positive connotation, that there's a passion and a drive. You see the agendas behind books that perhaps are wanting to settle a score, or where you take a particular side of an issue that maybe is provocative in some way. The mission stems from your heart. I think that's the first thing. And it also stems from a true desire to help other people. And so in Brain on Fire, and I hope a lot of you did have the chance to read this book or had read it, and maybe others will still read it after they listen to this webinar. But in Brain on Fire, her mission is about advocacy for healthcare, for the hospital system, for accurate diagnoses. She gets misdiagnosed on multiple occasions. And so when she finally gets a team of people who believe, like her parents do, that no, it's not that she is crazy, but in fact has inflammation on her brain, she poses a lot of questions and talks about a lot of, I think, interesting speculation, I guess I would say, about other people who are in her position who might have been misdiagnosed and then not cured. So I do want to look at some of those specific examples to show you how she writes those things and what that looks like. But I also want to always, both of us in these shorter classes, always want to turn outward and ask you guys to consider this for your own books. Do you have a book that you know and can and will help people? That's the first question on the slide. And then how do you incorporate language that includes advocacy and education? So let's start with that one first and talk about how advocacy even shows up in writing. And so for Susannah, the first instance that I have, and her advocacy and education does show up in the latter half of the book, which makes sense because it won't really show up until she's diagnosed. But let's look at this question. Well, this is more of a pondering, I guess. It's on page 151, and there's just this little snippet of text that says, after she gets diagnosed and she's speculating about misdiagnosis, and she ends the chapter, again on page 151, saying, "It just begged the question, if it took so long for one of the best hospitals in the world to get to this step, how many other people were going untreated, diagnosed with a mental illness or condemned to a life in a nursing home or a psychiatric ward?" That is also a poignant question, or a provocative question, which is my point number 3, the power of these kinds of provocative questions. And I'm going to give you another one on page 222 and 223. I was really moved by these provocative questions because I think they force you to think. And in some of these cases, it's a real travesty to imagine that not just people living today, but people living throughout history perhaps were condemned to horrible lives because they were misdiagnosed. And it's interesting, and it just gets your wheels turning a bit. So what she's done here is, and I'm not going to read this whole passage because it's too long, but the interesting part of it starts on page 222 when she says evil. To the untrained eye, anti-NMDA receptor autoimmune encephalitis can certainly appear malevolent. Afflicted sons and daughters suddenly became possessed, demonic-like creatures out of our most appealing nightmares. Imagine a young woman into the air and off her bed. I'll jump forward, contorted her body and crab walked down the staircase, hissing like a snake and spewing blood. And she goes into this long thing and she evokes The Exorcist. And then she asks the provocative question on page 223, how many children throughout history have been exorcised and then left to die when they did not improve? How many people currently are in psychiatric wards and nursing homes denied the relatively simple cure of steroids, plasma exchange, IVIG treatment, and, in the worst cases, more intense other therapy or chemotherapy? So she gets into these statistics, and I think they're incredibly powerful, and she's just asking questions. This book, you'll note on the back cover if you have the paperback, was the winner of Books for a Better Life Award, which is a book that changes lives. That's actually what it's set up to do. And that's why we got the title of tonight's webinar, to talk about books that change lives and how do you position your own book to create something that has the capacity to change lives. And what you have to also think about is to broaden it beyond just your specific issue when possible. So Brain on Fire is obviously about an autoimmune disease. It's about inflammation of the brain. It's about what happens to her. And there's a million other more interesting things about this book than just this, which we're going to get into tonight as well. But let's consider how she broadened her particular issue. And she does this in many instances, but one of them is on page 229. And so right in the middle of this page, the third paragraph, it starts, although anti-NMDA receptor autoimmune encephalitis is rare, it is one of the more than 100 different kinds of autoimmune diseases that afflict an estimated 50 million people in the United States, a staggering figure that has more than tripled in the past 3 decades. And if you skip forward, it also says, autoimmune diseases are most likely the #1 cause of disability in women of all ages. And she goes on to talk about the theories and the why, and why more about women, and all of a sudden she's got you, right? Because everybody, if these are the statistics, everyone knows someone who has an autoimmune disease in your family, a friend, and it begs this much larger question about a way broader issue than just her very particular anti-NMDA receptor autoimmune encephalitis, which is very small. And I think if she would have gone to her publisher and said, oh, I'm just writing this book about this very specific kind of autoimmune encephalitis, a publisher might have said, well, that's not big enough because how many people are actually diagnosed with that every year? But she's able to broaden it and to make it more relevant to anyone who suffers from an autoimmune disease. 50 million people in the United States, it's a huge number. So we're looking at Susannah and what she did, but whatever your issue is, no matter what you have, if you can broaden that statistic and make it so that your particular memoir and the thing that you're doing has reverberating effects, that's going to help you both in terms of your readership, your platform, and your potential for getting a publishing deal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think this is the challenge that we all have, because a memoir is such a personal story, and many memoirists are, struggle with this issue, and so I think it's really great that we are talking about broadening and how to move forward with our own story.
Always an important question to ask yourselves, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, all right. So, one of the things that many people that we teach struggle with from time to time is how to make their story broader, for one thing, and also issues about memory. They say, well, I can't remember, and so in order to be really authentic, I need to say, I can't remember. So if you've looked at Susannah's book at all, or read the summaries about it, she lost her memory in the middle of her struggle to get better and to get diagnosed. So she drew upon all kinds of techniques, and they're really excellent techniques that they're specific to her, and then I'm going to talk about some ways that you can use similar techniques in case you don't have the same kind of medical information that she does. So the first one is journals, diaries, and notes. She kept her own diary up to a point that she could still keep it. She took a few notes until she couldn't write any longer. But there's some really good examples, and I'm going to give one right now about how she was able to use her 45. Oh, and by the way, when she's quoting, he goes into their point of view, and so something that we're always talking about in learning memoir is that a memoir is from the I point of view, from your own point of view, but you're not really breaking the if you carefully use someone else do, you just set it up properly like she does here on page 45. My mom felt the foreboding, and she began to cry uncontrollably, certain that something was seriously wrong. It was the first and last time she would allow herself to completely succumb to her emotions in the frightening months that followed. So as you see, we know that her mother felt this way because her mother would have told her. And this is woven throughout the entire book, where she carefully lets us know how she knows something through someone else's point of view. And the second one is from her father on page, let's see, this is page 95. He remembers one cold, damp, early spring morning driving to the hospital with Giselle in silence, his, his friend, their friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, his wife. So he knew she would have given anything to help share some of his suffering, but even so, he remained disengaged, bottling up his anguish the way he always had. He kissed her goodbye and squeezed into the crowded elevator. It was excruciating taking this trip alongside fresh-faced new fathers being ferried to the maternity floor, and so on. And so she tracks her father through his arrival at the hospital, where he's going to be seeing her in a rather desperate condition. And, so we end up empathizing for her because she's told these things and she knows how much pain it causes them, but it weaves the story together really beautifully, and um, we can use that technique as well. I'm going to give another couple techniques that she uses first before I go into what you can do. So she uses videos. We don't all have videos. Certainly we don't have maybe, well, we might have movies of the past when we're young, if somebody took movies of us, but she uses videos as evidence. And so evidence is a journalistic technique. Uh, Drawing upon delivering evidence, delivering research is a journalistic technique. And actually, memoirists can do that a lot more than we realize, I think, once we give ourselves permission to do that. So on page 145, uh, she talks about this video and she writes out what's on the video. She quotes the information that's on the video and gives it to us as part of the evidence. So this is a great technique for us to be using, is to be translating. She's essentially translating information. So in the video she says what she's wearing and what people say and then what she does. So I found that really quite fascinating that she did that. Another thing that she does is she goes into other people's points of view, including the doctor. And so there's this doctor finally who understands what has happened to her, or he certainly takes seriously that he's going to investigate it. And so she uses what he knows on page 130. For instance, he's examining evidence of the examination in a scene. So she's using scenic techniques. And so in the middle of this page, on page 130, she's showing what she does, and then she says, hellishly, she's talking about reaching her hand to her face and missing her nose, hellishly catatonic, he thought. So she goes through here and says what she's doing, and then she weaves in what he thought, what he was understanding to be happening, naming it. So he says, taking a minute to think it through, I began walking in short spurts, but with delays. I angled toward my left side. Najjar noticed I was showing signs of ataxia. So when we're saying he noticed, we're in his point of view. So she interviewed him as well as other family members and friends to get the information that she could put in the book. And we can do that too. I'm going to talk about how now. So, Brooke, the next slide. There we go. Okay, so again, you can draw from journals. We do warn people about getting sucked in and overwhelmed by the amount of detail in old journals. So draw upon it cautiously, but it can inform you of states of mind and also of things that you actually have forgotten that are relevant to the story. You do need to filter what isn't relevant, which is already a problem when writing a memoir for some people. But for other people, reading the journals is really a necessary and important point. So we'll leave it up to you to decide how you want to do it. Again, we were talking about videos and movies and photo albums. These bring to life moments in a way that our memory may have forgotten, or it highlights details that we didn't notice before, perhaps when we watch these things. Now that we're writing a memoir, we're looking for evidence, we're looking for history, we're looking for these documentaries of our lives. One thing you can do, and we talk with people a lot who say that they're really troubled by what they don't remember. Make lists of what you do remember. Actually writing things down, free writing lists, free writing scenes, meaning just start writing, can unlock memories in amazing ways. And if you're able to write longhand, sometimes that can be very helpful to you. The writing begets writing. So the more that you can just say how you think things were. You can say, I imagine it was like this, if you're not quite sure. We really need to not just say throughout a book, I don't remember, I don't remember, I don't remember. I've seen some of that, of people doing that, and after a while, I'm missing a lot of the story, which is frustrating. So these are some of the draw. We're going to forward and learn some more about how Susannah writes her story book.
Yeah, and I loved this structure that she offers. People in our classes, especially in our long class, are always asking about how many chapters should I have, how long should they be, all these questions about how to put your book together. And of course, every book varies, but what you can do is spend time looking at different books' table of contents to get a sense for how they do it. Look at her structure and her narration, and then we can kind of talk about why this matters. I think studying anyone else's arc, how they do what they do, is so incredibly valuable to help you understand how you might put your book together. So let's start by an examination of her table of contents, which is 3 parts. Part 1 is called Crazy, Part 2 is called The Clock, and Part 3 is called Time. Those of you who read the book, what she's referring to with the clock is the aha moment. When the doctor comes in and asks her to talk, what she ends up drawing is the entire clock all on one side. It's on page 132. And so what that allowed them to realize was that it was evidence that the right hemisphere of her brain was inflamed. And it was really that click moment for her team that there was something definitely wrong with her brain and that she wasn't just crazy, which is basically they thought it was psychiatric. And this was evidence that it was in fact physiological. So in terms of these 3 parts, what my interpretation of this, and other people may have different interpretations, which is what's awesome about memoir is that we could discuss this and we could say, okay, well, who are the various I's? Who shows up in this journey? And Linda Joy and I, when we sat down to talk, could identify 8 or 9 different I's. But the ones that I think show up here, if we're just looking at part 1, part 2, and part 3, in part 1, it's her normal self, but she knows something is wrong. And that's called crazy. She just is like, what is going on with me? I'm going crazy. And it's an examination of that experience. The clock, part 2, is her sick self. She's in the hospital. She's definitely sick. There's a discovery that she has this inflammation of the brain. It's encephalitis. It's not psychiatric. And so that is the hospital and what's going on with her. And she completely loses sense of her original I self. And then the third part, In Search of Lost Time, is her recovering self. This is when her brain swelling has gone down. She's back to Susannah, but she's not the same. She'll be forever altered, and she's trying to make sense of who she was and what happened. So let's look at some of the different techniques that she offers. There's all kinds of stuff in the beginning of the book in which she talks about just not feeling right. And on page 26, for instance, at the end of this chapter, she writes, I would soon learn firsthand that this kind of illness often ebbs and flows, leaving the sufferer convinced that the worst is over, even when it's only retreating for a moment before pouncing again. And so this is in the aftermath of being giddy. I mean, she was really manic and had all kinds of symptoms and couldn't quite figure out what was going on, and she was definitely not herself. And there's lots of instances of that. And on page 41, we have a true turning point. And I think this is the moment when we realize that she's going into a different place. And she's super overt about it, and I particularly like this because I think we're sometimes asking our students to be more obvious, and people push back and say, well, I don't want to be too obvious. The reader should understand that. That's the definition of showing. Well, listen to this, okay? I mean, she's telling the reader, I'm not okay, and from this point forward, I'm not going to be okay. And this is how obvious it is. It says, I would never regain any memories of this seizure or the ones to come. This moment, my first serious blackout, marked the line between sanity and insanity. Though I would have moments of lucidity over the coming weeks, I would never again be the same person. This was the start of the dark period of my illness, as I began an existence in purgatory between the real world and a cloudy, fictitious realm made up of hallucinations and paranoia. From this point on, I would increasingly be forced to rely on outside sources to piece together this lost time. So this is telling. She is telling us what is going on and what's about to happen, and that from this moment she doesn't remember. And it's very helpful because then as we're reading forward and we're watching her piece together with evidence and all the things that Linda Joy just mentioned, the other people's points of view and the interviewing and the this and the that, we're not wondering, well, what is she doing? Why is she doing this? She's set it up, and that is the setup. And that's all it took, incredibly, and it's also helpful. She's not leaving us in the dark. So those kinds of things can really be meaningful for your reader. And then there's other things in part two, her sick self. I mean, again, you could pick any passage on any page about her sick self and just, you know, that she was still in there. There's all these moments of friends coming by and her frustration and not really being herself. I mean, in a lot of it, she just wasn't even there. But then as she begins to regain herself in part three, I wanted to share a few passages because I really liked how she reconciled and how she talked about it. So if we could jump forward to page 153, this is right before the line break. She says, in other words, there seemed to be a dramatic change between the person I had been and the person I was now. But it was difficult at the time to distinguish my problems understanding from my inability to communicate, and whether these would persist long or short term. So again, she's really letting us know that she wasn't herself, and that now she's trying to figure out who she is. And she does this a lot in this section. This alter I. Really is different I voices. It's a different narrator in a lot of ways. So I'm going to share a couple more examples. Another one is on page 176 page. What did it feel like to be a different person, people ask. It's a question that's impossible to answer with conviction because, of course, during that dark period, I didn't have any real self-awareness that allowed me the luxury of contemplation, the ability to say, this is who I am and this is who I was. Still, my memory does retain a few moments from those weeks right after the hospital. It's the closest I can get to recapturing what it was like to feel so utterly divorced from myself. So she's very speculative and insightful, and she goes deep in. It is an examination of self, which is what memoir is. And this is the kind of stuff that I think memoirists sometimes get dinged for navel gazing, and I want to say, screw that. You know, it is part of memoir writing. You need to sometimes look and ask yourself, who am I? What was I doing? On page 205 in the middle toward the bottom, now I think that this shame emerged out of the precarious balancing act between fear of loss and acceptance of loss. Yes, I could read again, or yes, I could once again read and write and make to-do lists, but I had lost confidence and a sense of self. Who am I? Am I a person who cowers in fear She goes on to really explore this. I didn't even know who I was anymore. So this is powerful. Obviously, she lost herself, and it's an coming back to herself. But there are lots of you who may be experimenting with these kinds of eyes in your memoir, and there are lots of ways to do that. And a final note on the pacing, all I wanted to note here is that it's fast, and she does weave together all of these different interesting elements. And the fast pace and the short chapters and all these different ways that she weaves together her video clips, her journal entries, her hallucinations, it makes for an experience that you feel like you're in it with her, and she's done it pretty masterfully. And you could take some of those elements that you like and you could incorporate them into your own memoir, or you could use them as inspiration to say, well, what kinds of things do I have that I might want to explore? And there's so much in reading other people's memoirs that ends up being fodder for future ideas. And so take those things. It's not stealing. It's learning and using other people's inspiration to create your own thing.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I don't know the really good quote, but there's a really good quote about how from some writer about how it isn't stealing, it's inspiration, so.
Well, and Cheryl Strayed has said that, in fewer words, but absolutely. So, and many famous memoirists who we all admire get their inspiration and they learn from others, so for sure.
If musicians and painters can do it, we can do it.
Yes.
They do it all the time. So we're going to look at the use of journalism to make your points, and I'm going to talk about what she does and also more about what you can do, because again, we're trying to help you apply all this to your own, to your own memoir. So the important thing that journalists do that I think we could do more of as memoir writers, really to broaden our memoir and make it more accessible. It does help to deal with that memoirists are just writing about themselves and it's not relevant to other people. We don't agree with that in general, but as we're teaching students, there's various elements that we're going to be teaching in the 4-week class. Very specific techniques about how to broaden your work, and that you can use as you're figuring out the work. To touch on how to think about it now and the techniques in the longer class. So research is one of the things that she does, that she presents to learn about her problem and feel informed. And it's a very, her book is pretty scientifically oriented. So she talks about neuroscience and so on. And so one example of that is on page 101. She talks about, my short-term memory had been obliterated, a problem usually rooted in the hippocampus, which is like a way station for memories. Hippocampus briefly stores the patterns of neurons that make up a memory before passing them along to the parts of the brain responsible for preserving them long term, etc. I mean, as a memoirist, I think that's very interesting just in and of itself to understand how memory works. But she gives us some of that science as part of educating us. Another technique she uses, though, she does tell and she does show both. An example of combining those are on page 106 and 107. She talks about her symptoms at the top of page 106, where she talks about the beautiful mess. She says, it was as if my tongue was 5 sizes too big for my mouth. This scared my mother more than the hallucinations. There she goes back again into her mother's point of view. The paranoia and the escape attempts. This was memorable, consistent change, but in decidedly the wrong direction. And she goes back into the when I spoke, I drooled, and when I was tired, my tongue hung out. I spoke in garbled sentences, and so forth. And on it goes all the way over to page 107, where she's talking about what she's doing, and then she gives some explanation about the brain. The top of the spinal cord and the underside of the brain is the brain stem and the more primitive parts, which helps oversee basic life or death functions. And so she goes on to talk about these different parts of the brain. So she weaves together her own experience seamlessly in with information that is telling us things that we need to know, which is what we're talking about here. I want to give another example, though, of, I mean, she mixes so many interesting techniques. And I think that some memoirists feel constrained about playing with voice or being able to play with the way. And so this is a really good book as an example of to give you ideas on how you can break out of that kind of fear or that kind of constraint. So on page 118, she has some things in italics that she's remembering or imagining or almost dreaming. And she blends together her experience with reality with her experience of semi-conscious or semi-off conscious, out of consciousness moments. The hum of the guitar, the soft tap on the drums, the swell of music. It's Halloween night at Harlem's Apollo Theater. I'm at a Ryan Adams concert. I can see him on stage. But I can't keep my eyes open to watch the scene. I feel a touch on my skin. It makes me shudder. I hear a voice. Susannah, time to take vitals. Concert disappears, dissolving into the dark hospital room. The nurse next to me. I'm back in the place where there is no night and there is no day. So a very poetic moment that she sets apart using italics, which works super well. And then on the very next page, we have some more evidence presented, and she uses a different typeface. She uses that several times, including some actual handwriting that she gets into her book, which I find quite interesting. So she lists symptoms. We have more information here. What is catatonia? So on page 119, I'm not going to read all of that, but symptoms, bullet points, and then talks about the information there in a way that makes it really interesting for us to understand it, and easy with a lot of white space and so on, so we're not bombarded with information. And then the next part is very journalistic on page 195. She puts the brain and how it works and how people have tried to fix brain problems in the past in the context of history with the Kennedy family. So she has several paragraphs about what happened with Rosemary Kennedy and the lobotomy that she had and why that was done at that time. And she references Jack Nicholson's character, Randall McMurphy, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So she brings literature and actual history into this. So I want to talk a little bit more on the next slide about writing and scene and weaving, telling and showing. So you heard Brooke talking about telling, the need to be telling. What we've done in teaching, many of us writing teachers have done in teaching writing over the years, is so many people used to come to us, particularly as memoir teachers, just telling all the time. So we've been teaching everybody, including in the MFA programs around the country and stuff, how to show and not just tell, to where it got a little uneven. We even found an article in one of the literary magazines talking about how we also need to remember to be sure and tell the reader, and that telling is perfectly an important, good thing to be doing. It's how we find the balance. So we're going to talk much more about all that in the longer class. But the other thing you want to do is think about, what is your topic? It could be travel, like we say here, cooking, healing, genealogy. But we run into a lot of memoir writers who are writing very deep books about abuse or healing of some sort. Maybe not so much medical, maybe emotional, maybe psychological. Maybe the writing has to do with abuse and sexuality. There's ways to broaden that, and I think a lot of times people don't think about it is to put think about and research and put in the book uh, other information, statistics, do some research, bring in other articles that support your point of view that you're making in your own memoir. Uh, that's being using the journalistic techniques. That's being very much of a journalist. That's what they would do, is do the research. So for your research, certainly use Google. You can use Google Earth to just launch yourself down. I've actually used Google Earth to go to the street that I grew up on, and kind of walk myself down the street and look at the houses there, and go and look at other parts of the town. It did bring back a lot of memories. It was a very emotional thing to do. I was quite surprised. If you visit your hometown that you're writing about, or research towns that you lived in, or go to buildings where you have a lot of memories, and you can research what weather is on certain days. There's amazing things out in Google now that can bring your memoir alive in ways that you may not have really thought of doing before. So we just want to encourage you to feel free to use these techniques, and of course we'll be talking about all of that in the longer course as well. Brooke?
Yeah, so I'm just going to take a second here to tell you all about the longer course and just about our stuff in general. We have so many alumni on here, so thank you all for continuing to join us. But we do have more in our 6-month course, and we always do these offers. And this is part of a longer course, as it always is. So if you're here for the freebie, we are welcoming of you. Always, 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 always come for the free stuff, but also consider when it's relevant and when you're ready to dive in deeper, joining us for the 4 course. And so it's still $75 for the 4 weeks, and it will start a week from tonight, which is the 19th, and we will do 4 consecutive weeks on the Brain on Fire. And if you go to the home page of writeyourmemoirin6months.com, there's an easy link there right on the right-hand side under the Brain on Fire stuff. But you can see the syllabus, exactly what we're covering. It's the question of memory, especially because I think that's a really big one. There's more on narration and all kinds of important things, story structure. So we love teaching these classes, and the $75 will last through tomorrow night, and then we'll raise the price to $89. And then also for people who join us on these calls, you have the opportunity to sign up for the 6-month course to get a discount as well. And so that's all detailed here. And then we also want to let you all know that we have a conference coming up in October. It's not too late to join us. It is the Magic of Memoir, and it's on October 15th and 16th. And I know we have a lot of people on the call who are coming, and we're super excited about it. It's in California, in-person offerings, and we did it last year, and it was phenomenal. And this year is only going to be better. So these are all the things that we have going on, and we particularly hope that you'll join us in some capacity, but the main thing is this Brain on Fire class that starts a week from tonight.
Yeah, we hope you can come, and you know, and also I think working with point of view and looking at alternative ways to break out of the I and to broaden is just it's a very exciting book that we're using to help people learn about doing that. So we hope you can join us.
All right, so without further ado, we're going to get into some of the questions that you might have, and some people emailed us questions in advance, so do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A window, and this is a fun part too because people have interesting observations. And let's see, Mickey is asking here if we're supposed to have read the book or supposed to have the book, and the answer is Yeah, I mean, if you can read the book before the 4-week class, you will absolutely get more out of the class. At the bare minimum, we recommend buying the book because then you can at least track with us because we're going to be using the paperback to reference the pages that we're reading from, and we don't put those up on the slides because it just goes a little haywire with a lot of text. Okay, so this question came in from Rochelle, and the question is, how does the writer frame the memoir story to protect those who still might be alive, or should that not even be a consideration? What do you think, Joy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that most people, unless they have a revenge agenda, want to consider people who are alive in some form or another without silencing themselves. And that's a tricky balance sometimes. So I mean, part of what we suggest is kind of a two-part thing, is first write for yourself exactly the way you need to, using the correct names and everything, and telling your whole truth. Because your first draft is not going to be your published draft ever. You will have plenty of time to muse over what you've revealed and how much you've exposed of yourself or other people in the book before you decide what you need to do in terms of publishing. We always suggest, or the way I like to talk about it, is create a safe space around you in which to explore your own truth. And most people do have to juggle with that question. And by the time you've finished your first draft, you'll be in a much better place to figure out what to do about it.
Great advice. And my were similarly driven based on 30 misdiagnoses before finding the right one. However, I believe had a lot to do with my ability to survive 7 years of medical trials and near-death experiences. Is it too much to delve into so much in one book? Childhood abuse, a broken home, 7 years of culminating illness into a coma. And you know, I'll take this one, Shannon, just to say I don't think you'll know until you're in it. And in our 6-month class, a lot it's very common. And then down. But if you, for instance, decided to do the framed memoir, which is what we've taught in Wild with Cheryl Strayed, that there's a particular time period that exists. And so for that book, Wild, the time period was her time on the Pacific Crest Trail, and then she pops out of the timeline and into the past. You could do something like that with your illness, or even in the coma or the aftermath of the coma or something like that, and you could flash back to childhood abuse in a broken home, particularly if you said it informed the moment and that was what lent to your ability to survive. So in that case, these memories would inform the present. But if you want to do something that is more of a coming of age memoir that is going to go into great depth about your childhood experience, then I think that would be a secondary/second memoir. So that's my offering on that point.
Yeah, I like the idea, though. I could sort of imagine if you feel that there's an emotional point you want to make, that if you were in the now and you dip back and pick up flashback moments, that you could weave those in. It wouldn't be everything, but it would be significant moments that you feel are that you've chosen to present.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are good questions. Suzanne, I just want to acknowledge that I see your question about membership, and we will get back to you separately about that because it's not really pertinent to this, but someone will be in touch with you. And then, so Carol asks, what if the memoir structure has to do with a client's suicide? I'm stuck as to whether to talk to the mother now about what I'm doing versus putting in all the work and then having her nix it.
Well, I think you would need permission. I don't know what kind of client that was. You know, completely change everything. It gets very complicated. It kind of
Yeah, I mean, I want to share that I'm working with someone right now who essentially outs as gay one of his ex-trainers, and he was asking me about libel issues, and I said, well, is he out now? And he says, no, he's completely closeted. And I was like, yeah, that is grounds for concerned about, recognize them child. You just need to change all identifying details about them. Or you may, if you have a client kind of situation, you need to create a composite. So it's not just that, maybe three people that, I don't know how common that is in your practice. The most important thing.
Yeah.
So, Chris, I love your point about greater purpose or message for your memoir. Do you think a memoir has to have a super broad and applicable message to be successful? No.
Okay, all right.
Well, what were you going to say? Or are we going to disagree on this point? You'd say what you were going to say.
No, I wanted you to cover it because you're a publisher and you've really seen so many different memoirs in your work. So go ahead.
Yeah, I've seen very specific ones. I think Susannah's is such a great example because what she's done is she's taken this very specific thing that very few people suffer from, and she's made it much broader because she asks all of these potent questions that I reference, about like, well, how many people like me have been misdiagnosed? And she makes it really about advocacy and hospital, healthcare patient advocacy. And so anyone can do that with a small issue and broaden it out. And it's why we teach so much about our longer course, because there's a much bigger theme. This is an ill memoir, but not really. It's bigger than that. And so I think if you can look at your particular issue, and even if it's very niche, make it broader. That said, does it have to be super broad or applicable to 50 million people? No. But I've seen some very niche memoirs that have ended up being quite successful. And one of the things I would caution you about, especially because I do come out of traditional publishing, is agents and editors who tell you, oh, well, there's just too narrow of a market for this and it's not going to sell. In that case, then you have not done a good enough job explaining that there is a broader market. And there is someone who recently contacted me and said, well, my book is like very specific to Alberta, Canada. And I was like, okay, well, that might be a little niche then. If it's like, it's only going to sell, and there are those books, but almost anyone else, I think it's your responsibility to make them broader. Okay, so do we offer other classes? And the answer is yes. I mean, especially like you're asking, Jeannie, about childhood, family, aging. We've taught so many of these classes, and they're for sale on our website. And there's several coming of age. There's Angela's Ashes, there's The Glass Castle, and you can look at our archives if you are looking for something that's what you have written. So definitely take a look at that on our site, please. Amanda asks, would a false writer's name names in a book cover you from libel?
Well, it's so complicated. We get this question a lot. A pseudonym, if you're a memoirist. I think where it gets tangled up is if you're writing about truth in a memoir, but everything else is changed, including your own name. I just think it gets complicated. And we're not legal. We can't really advise you legally, because we're not attorneys. But if you have legal questions, I think you should contact a literary attorney and run it by them, because plenty of people who write fiction are also about before things, but changing characteristics. If people are still they could still be recognizable. Way make your own decisions as to contact a literary attorney. You can Google literary attorneys. I do know of a Robert Pym, PMO. You can contact him, and just invest in a consultation so that you feel comfortable writing your story.
The other thing that you can do is talk to other people who have done it. I mean, we have a number of people because someone is asking here about ex-husband, and we just published a book on press called Not Exactly Love, in which Hafner, her real name, has published the story of domestic abuse. And we were very careful. And so it might be interesting if that is, part of your story, to look into that. People use their maiden names, but there's just so many considerations. But, a lot of people are concerned about this, and it's a particular question, and it's one that comes up all the time. But to Linda Joy's earlier point, write your story with the real names. Don't worry about this until you get closer to publication, because these are things that prevent people from writing their books. You basically are like so consumed with the what if, the what if, the what if, and the book then never gets written. So I want to encourage everybody specifically to, if you're having these things, is like you change these details later. Yeah. For now.
And a lot of times the worry doesn't come true. I mean, and sometimes, but a lot of times we find out that it doesn't come true. And so, good, you just don't know. You just need to decide, what do you need to write? How do you need to write it? Your passion, and it is, I think, if you're on this call, trying to figure out what to do. So we just want to try to give you permission to do your creative work.
Yeah, exactly. So Mickey has a question about the 4 weeks course. If we record everything we do. So absolutely, you need to miss class. You'll always get the recording. And keep the question. And Bonnie, if you understand something time you're writing about it, can you include that understanding? How do you make it clear that you didn't realize that until much later?
Yes.
I just want to rest the thing. She has now is different from before. And this is the very nature of reflection in memoir. Not only are you supposed to do this, you have to. And that understanding that you're talking about, Bonnie, is so critical to memoir writing, because if you fail to incorporate your now understanding, then you have a very flat memoir. And the only case in which you would not do it is coming of age.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the clue is, you can say, and later I would understand. But where to put it, So it's all woven into what is your structure, how are you going back and forth in time, and how are you flashing forward. And these are very common techniques, and it's just a matter of learning more and doing the writing and figuring out how to make it work for yourself.
And this question of narration is a really, really big one, Bonnie, because what you're talking about is balancing different narrative voices. You have a one-eye narrator who is at a certain point, moving through your book, who is maybe, 40 years old. And then there's the now narrator of now, who's the person who understands things in a different way. So it's a big deal. And then she's sharing she's working on coming of age. So there you go.
Yeah, right.
And Janice asks about your book, Linda Joy, the title, who's publishing it, and when it's coming out.
Oh, that's nice. All right. It's called Song of the Plains, a memoir of secret, silence, and a lifelong search to break family patterns. It's coming out in the summer of 2017, and it's being published by She Writes Press. And because I just like 10 minutes ago figured out for the about eighth time what the title is. I'll be putting some stuff out on social media about it and blogging about it at this point, but I will first, and thank you so much for asking.
Yeah, thanks, Janice. And why isn't reflection necessary in coming of age? It's not. It doesn't never happen for a double negative for you, but it's not necessary because oftentimes the child doesn't have a deep reflective capacity. We covered this in depth in our Glass Castle course, in which Jeanette makes some very interesting observations, but and she is just trying to make sense of her experience, and it's not often reflective. It's much more handled in where you're understanding something because she intentionally wants you to, but she's not being particularly reflective because reflection is a often more mature capacity. So that's the short answer. And you guys have been great. It's 5 o'clock on the Pacific Coast and very, very late in London, so we'll let Linda Joy go. And we appreciate your time. We hope to see some of you in the 4-week class, and find us online, both on Twitter and Facebook, and keep writing.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and write your story and figure out all these other details later. And it's about learning craft and listening to your passion. So hope you do that. Take good care.
Good night, everyone.
Night, everybody. Bye.